At 3 in the morning, it wasn't noise that woke Victor. It was silence. His newborn son had stopped fighting. The goat's milk wasn't enough. And the only one who could save the boy was the orc woman the town had just thrown into the mud. The cold crept in through the gaps in the workshop walls like a living thing. Victor sat in his rocking chair near the hearth, a half-carved chair leg resting across his knees, his hands too tired to work and too restless to stop. The fire had burned down to orange coals. Outside, the wind scraped against the shutters with the patience of something that had nowhere else to be. He had not meant to fall asleep. He never meant to anymore. Sleep came like a thief and left him hunched and stiff, his neck aching. The smell of pine shavings and cold iron settled into his clothes. He stood slowly, working the knots from his shoulders, and moved to the back room where the oak cradle sat against the wall. Elias lay bundled in wool scraps, his small chest rising and falling in shallow pools. Victor leaned over the cradle's edge and watched. The boy had Lucy's brow, curved and smooth, and a mouth that sometimes pursed in sleep as though tasting something far away. Victor pressed 2 fingers against his son's chest just to feel the heartbeat. It was there, faint, stubborn. He carried the tin cup of goat's milk to the fire and warmed it. The spoon was carved from bone. He had made it himself during the long nights after Lucy died, because his hands needed something to do, or they would have done something worse. He sat beside the cradle and tried to feed the boy. Elias turned his face away. It wasn't the first time. For 3 days now, the boy had taken barely enough to stay alive. The curandera from Millbrook had come and gone, leaving behind a cloth of dried herbs and a look in her eyes that Victor had been trying not to read since. He dipped the spoon again, touched it to the boy's lips. The child gave a soft sound, not quite a cry, something quieter and more frightening. Victor set the cup down. He pressed his palms against his eyes. The tavern had been hell earlier that evening. He had gone for grain and ended up watching the barkeep drag a woman out by the collar while 2 men threw insults after her like stones. She'd been asking for a dry corner to sleep in, nothing more. Her skin was the color of raw jade. Her ears tapered to soft points, and her tusks were small and pale, barely visible beneath her lip. An orc. Alone. In the middle of a northern winter storm. He had followed her out of the tavern without thinking. The sleet had been driving sideways. She had stood in the mud outside, not running, just standing, with the particular stillness of someone who had been refused so many times they had stopped looking surprised. He had told her, bread and shelter, 1 night, no questions. She had looked at him for a long time before nodding. Now she sat at his kitchen table, wrapped in a patched oilskin, her dark eyes on the dying fire. She had barely spoken 3 words since entering. Victor looked from his son to the woman to his son. Something moved in the edge of his vision, just for a moment, a shimmer near the cradle's corner, like the air itself was paying attention. He blinked and it was gone. He picked up the tin cup again, tried once more. The boy turned away again. Victor set the cup down on the floor and stayed crouched there, one hand on the side of the cradle, forehead nearly touching the oak he had cut and shaped himself. He had built this cradle in the weeks before Elias was born. He had sanded every edge twice. He had carved small leaves along the headboard because Lucy had asked him to. Lucy had died on the 3rd morning after the birth. Not dramatically. No final words, no reaching for his hand. She had simply been there. And then she had been less there. And then she was not there at all. The fever took her quietly, and the house had been quiet ever since in a way that felt like an accusation. He had made a promise to her. He had not said it aloud because the midwife was still in the room, but he had made it in the place where promises actually live, somewhere behind the ribs. He would keep the boy alive. He would see Elias grow strong enough to carry the name. The name had been her idea. Elias. After Victor's grandfather, a stubborn, leather-faced man who had built the first real workshop on the northern frontier and lived to see grandchildren. Lucy had said a name like that carried something. Victor had agreed without fully understanding what she meant. He thought he was beginning to understand now. The woman at the table shifted in her chair. Victor heard the leather of her coat creak. "He will not take it," he said. He was not sure why he spoke to her, perhaps because there was no one else. She looked at him without surprise. Her eyes were a dark amber, the color of pine resin held up to a low light. She had a calm about her that was not comfort. It was more like the calm of a stone in a river. "He needs something else," she said. Victor looked at her. "He's a newborn. He needs milk." She said nothing to that. She looked at the boy in the cradle, and something moved across her face, a small internal flinching, quickly controlled. He had not seen an expression like that on anyone before, but he recognized it the way you recognize a wound beneath bandaging. She had lost someone too. He did not know how he knew this. He knew. He straightened up. His back ached. His hands were rough and cracked from the cold and from years of working wood that didn't want to be worked. He was 34 years old, and he felt considerably older. "I don't know what else there is," he said. "I do," she said. The word sat in the room. Victor looked at her. She was watching the child, not him, watching with an attention that was not curiosity, but something more weighted, more personal. He did not ask. He waited. She stood slowly and crossed the room to the cradle. She looked at the boy for a moment, then at Victor. "My name is Orlena," she said. "I had a daughter. She did not survive the crossing at the iron borders." She paused. "I still have what I had for her." Victor understood then. He stood in the middle of his own kitchen, holding his dead wife's promise, looking at a stranger who carried her own grief like armor, and he did not move for a long time. Then he looked at his son. Then he made a choice. He handed her the boy. It was not a graceful gesture. His arms moved before his mind caught up, and for one brief, terrible moment he thought his hands would not open, that something older and smaller than reason would refuse the act. But then Elias was in Orlena's arms, and her hands took him with a sureness that Victor did not have, and the exchange was done. She sat back in the chair near the fire. She adjusted the child with the efficiency of someone who had done this before, who knew the weight and the angle. Elias made a small, confused sound. Then he went quiet. Victor turned away. He stood at the workshop door, his back to the room, and stared at his tools hanging on the wall, chisels in order of size, 3 hammers. The broad plane he had inherited from his father, a tool he had used since he was 12, worn smooth at the handle where a hand had gripped it for decades before his. He looked at them for a long time, listening to the silence from behind him. And it was a different silence than it had been for days. It had weight to it. Something full instead of something empty. When he turned around, Elias was feeding. The boy's hands had opened. His fingers, which had been curled and stiff, were relaxed now, reaching without urgency, resting against the green warmth of Orlena's skin. She was not looking at Victor. She was looking at Elias with an expression he could not name and did not feel entitled to examine. He sat down at the table. He folded his hands. The fire popped. Outside, the wind eased a little, or maybe it didn't. Maybe he'd just stopped hearing it. "I should tell you," he said after a while. "I didn't follow you out of the tavern because I'm a good man." "I know," she said. "I followed you because I was desperate." "I know that too." He nodded. He had not expected absolution, and she had not offered it, and there was something honest in that which he found he could breathe in. "I'll make room in the loft," he said. "There are pelts up there, elk and wolf, good quality." "That will do. And there's bread from yesterday. Hard, but it'll soften." She nodded. He got up and started building the fire back up, adding 2 good pieces of pine and adjusting the grate. He was good at this, at the physical doing of things, at solving problems with his hands. He had been a carpenter since he was 12. He understood wood, how it moved with moisture, where it would fail, what it could hold. People were more complicated. His wife had been the one who understood people. He glanced at Orlena again, at the child in her arms. That shimmer he had seen by the cradle, he had almost forgotten it. Now it returned to him, not as a sight, but as a feeling, a slight pressure behind the eyes, a sense that something older than the room was watching the transaction they had just made. He shook it off. He was exhausted. Men who didn't sleep enough saw things at the edges. He told himself that. He almost believed it. Elias made a soft sound of satisfaction, and Victor felt something unknot in his chest that had been pulled tight for 3 days. By morning the storm had eased to a grey drizzle, and Millbrook was already awake. Victor heard the dray horses going past on the road before first light, and the sound of old Barrett's mill turning slow and steady in the wet air. The town made noise the way a body makes noise, without thinking about it, without stopping. He had slept 4 hours in the chair and woken clear-headed in a way he hadn't been since Elias was born. He built up the fire, sliced bread, boiled water for the bitter chicory root he kept in a cracked tin on the top shelf. He did not wake Orlena. She was sleeping in the loft, wrapped in the elk pelts, and he could hear her breathing slow and even above him. Elias slept in the cradle, colour in his cheeks, his hands open, relaxed. Victor stood over him for a while before going to the workshop. He had 3 commissions waiting: a repair on a merchant's chair, a new set of shelving for the schoolroom, and a door for the sheriff's office. The old one had warped and wouldn't shut properly. He started with the chair. The work was simple but demanded attention, and attention was something he could give today. Around mid-morning he heard boots on the porch. He came out of the workshop to find 2 men he didn't know well and one he knew too well. The 2 strangers were lean and watchful, with the unhurried posture of men paid to stand near trouble. The 3rd man was Ekthor. Ekthor held office as frontier warden, which in practice meant he collected taxes late and cut himself a share before passing them along. He was not large, but he had the compact, deliberate presence of someone who was used to rooms rearranging themselves around him. He wore a good coat, not for warmth, but for effect. Victor had known for some time that Ekthor had his eye on the acreage along the iron borders, land that Victor's grandfather had registered, and that sat valuable and quiet at the edge of the northern frontier. Ekthor had made 2 low offers in the past year. Both refused, and the refusals had not been forgotten. "Victor," he said, not a greeting, a placement. "Ekthor, I heard you brought something home from town last night." Victor leaned against the doorframe. He did not invite them in. "I brought a carpenter's commission to finish. I heard it was something green." Ekthor's expression didn't change. "I heard you pulled a clanner out of the mud and gave her your bed. My loft, and it's not your concern. The safety of this settlement is absolutely my concern." He glanced past Victor into the workshop. "The northern families don't want that kind of presence here. It makes people nervous." "The northern families," Victor said, "can speak to me directly." Ekthor looked at him for a moment, with the patience of someone who has many ways to get where he's going and isn't particular about which. "Think about what you're doing," he said finally. "You have a child to raise. You don't want trouble." "I've got a sick child who's eating for the first time in 3 days," Victor said. "What I don't want is to be standing in my own doorway talking to you." The 2 lean men were very still. Ekthor smiled, the kind of smile that stores things up. "We'll talk again," he said. Victor watched them walk back down the muddy path to the road, and the cold that settled in his stomach had nothing to do with the weather. The days shaped themselves into a routine that surprised him. Orlena was up before him most mornings, which he hadn't expected. She had a quality of movement that was almost completely silent. He would come downstairs and find the fire already built, water already heating, Elias already fed and sleeping again, and she would be sitting at the table with a short, bone-handled knife, repairing something on her coat or sharpening something he didn't examine too closely. He worked. She managed the child. They did not talk much, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was more like the silence of two people doing different work in the same room. He had known that feeling before, with Lucy, though it had been a different warmth. He asked her about the iron borders on the 5th day. She was quiet for a moment, turning a strip of leather in her hands. "My clan was crossing," she said. "There's a pass the clans use below the ridge called Gara de Jade Feroz. It floods in late autumn. We knew that. We thought we had time." She paused. "We did not have time." "Your daughter," he said. "She was 3 months. She did not have a name yet. In my clan, the name comes at the first thaw. She did not see a thaw." Victor said nothing. He set down his chisel. "I crossed alone after," Orlena said. "I was looking for something. I don't know what. Something to do with my hands." He understood that entirely. "You can stay," he said, "not as a guest, as someone who lives here if you want that. I'll pay you in board and coin, whatever the work is worth to you." She looked at him with those amber eyes that didn't give much away. "Ekthor will make trouble," she said. "He was going to make trouble anyway," Victor said. "He wants my land along the iron borders. The child is just a pretext." "The child is not a pretext," Orlena said quietly. "No," he agreed. "He's not." She looked at Elias in the cradle. Something passed across her face. Not the grief he had seen before, but something softer, more complicated. "There is a ritual," she said, "a binding of protection. My people do it for children. It requires certain things: bone ash, iron dust, a fire made of 3 different woods." She glanced at him. "I have not done it yet, because I did not know if you would permit it." He thought about it for one moment. "Do what you think is right," he said. She nodded once. That night she made a small fire in the yard from pine, oak, and cedar. She ground something between 2 stones. She said words in a language that sounded like rock against rock, low and deliberate. Victor watched from the porch, not interfering, not entirely easy, but not pulling away. When it was done, she came back inside. Elias slept through the whole night without a sound. Millbrook made its feelings known the way small settlements do, through the arrangement of silences. The miller stopped giving Victor a nod on the road. 2 women who had brought him sewing repairs let the work pile up at their door rather than collect it. A boy threw a stone at the workshop wall and ran, which Victor noted and did not chase. Ekthor's men were visible more often now, not doing anything, just visible, standing at corners, walking the road past the property twice in a morning. Victor continued working. He delivered the sheriff's door on schedule and got a long look from the deputy, who said nothing. He delivered the shelving to the schoolroom, and the school teacher, an older woman named Avret, gave him an extra coin and said quietly, "I knew your wife. She would have done the same thing." Then she added without prompting, "If it ever comes to it, I will speak. I have records going back 14 years, and I know how to use them." Victor nodded and held that for a while. Orlena moved around Millbrook only when necessary. She was not timid. That wasn't the right word. She was precise. She went where she had a reason to go and returned directly, and she met the look she got with an expression that offered them nothing to work with. But she brought things home with her. Dried herbs she had found in the scrub above the creek. A piece of flat stone that she began to carve small marks into over the evenings. A cord of braided sinew she worked with her fingers while Elias slept in her lap. The baby was thriving. This was the fact that held everything else steady. On a grey afternoon, 2 weeks after Orlena had arrived, Victor found her sitting outside on the chopping block, her hands still for once, looking south toward the ridge. Elias was asleep inside. A small grey cat from Barrett's mill had followed her home that morning, and now sat beside her feet, indifferent to the cold, apparently having decided this was where it lived now. "There's a spirit in this house," she said, when he came up beside her. He leaned against the fence post. "My wife." She nodded. She is not troubled. I want you to know that. She watches the child. That is all she is doing. He looked at the ridge. The pines up there were dark and still against the pale sky. That shimmer I've been seeing, he said, near the cradle. Yes, he exhaled. All right. She looked at him with something he could only call respect, the particular variety that is given not for what someone has done, but for what they've chosen to accept. She chose well, Orlena said. Your wife. He didn't ask what she meant. He wasn't sure he needed to. They sat out there until the cold drove them in, and the chimney sent up a thin thread of smoke into the darkening sky, and the cat followed them through the door without being invited, and inside a boy slept soundly in a carved oak cradle with small leaves along the headboard. Ekthor came on a Thursday mid-morning with 3 men and a written order. The order claimed that Victor was in violation of the frontier settlement codes, specifically the clause about harboring individuals of hostile race designation within the established perimeter of Millbrook. It was stamped with the warden's seal. It named Orlena by description, orc female, jade-toned, bearing clan markings, and ordered her removal from the property within 1 day. Victor read it twice. He folded it. He set it on the workbench. I want you off my property, he said. Ekthor had come prepared for several responses. This was apparently not one of them. He adjusted his stance. Victor, this isn't a discussion. This is an official... It's a piece of paper with your stamp on it, Victor said. The settlement codes you're citing were written for the border wars 30 years ago. They've been suspended 3 times, and they don't apply to private land. I'm the warden. I determine application. Then you're applying them wrong. Victor picked up his plane from the bench, not as a weapon, just something to hold. I know what this is. You've wanted the Iron Border acreage since before Lucy was in the ground. You're not here about codes. You're here about land. Ekthor's face did not change, which was its own confirmation. I'm giving you 1 day, Ekthor said, to make the right choice. I've already made it. One of the 3 men shifted, his hand moving toward his belt. Victor looked at him with the flat attention of someone who had grown up working with things that could take a finger off. From behind Victor, from the workshop doorway, there was a sound. Not loud, just a footstep on wood and the specific silence that follows someone stopping. Ekthor looked past Victor's shoulder. Orlena stood in the doorway, Elias held against her chest in a sling made from leather and braided cord. Her other hand was empty. She was not holding a weapon. She did not need to. She stood the way her people stood when they had decided something. Anyone who had ever traded with the clans or fought beside them or against them would have recognized it immediately. The 3 men were very still. Tomorrow, Ekthor said, and turned and walked back down the path. Victor listened to the sound of their boots on the frozen mud until he couldn't hear them anymore. Then he turned around. Orlena looked at him. Elias made a small sound, reaching for the braid on her collar. He will come back with more men, she said. I know. What do you want to do? Victor looked at his workshop, at the tools on the wall, at the cradle through the inner door, at the woman holding his son with the same sure-handed care she gave everything. I want to be ready, he said. He sent 3 letters that night. 1 went to the land registry office in the county seat, establishing a formal record of continuous residence and the nature of the household arrangement. 1 went to an advocate in the capital, a man Victor had done woodwork for 5 years ago, who owed him a favor, and had once mentioned he knew the settlement codes the way most men knew their own hands. The 3rd went to old Barrett at the mill, because Barrett had memory and standing in the settlement, and because there was a time, 30 years back, that Ekthor had cheated him on a grain tithe, and Barrett had never stopped knowing it. He worked through the following morning as though nothing was pending. He finished the merchant's chair. He started a repair on a porch railing that had been on the list for 2 weeks. He kept the fire high and the workshop door open, the way he always did when the weather permitted. Orlena sharpened her knives without comment. Elias discovered his own hand that morning, staring at it with profound concentration, and this occupied the household for a small while. Ekthor came back after noon. This time there were 5 men, and 2 of them were not Millbrook residents. They had the look of hired work, not cruel particularly, just professionally indifferent, which was its own kind of dangerous. Ekthor had also brought a woman Victor didn't know who carried herself like a magistrate, though she wore no official insignia. Victor came out of the workshop and stood in his yard. "The woman leaves," Ekthor said. "Now, or I start proceedings on the land." "The land is registered," Victor said. "The letter went out last night." Ekthor's expression shifted by a degree. "Avret already knew what I needed," Victor continued, and he saw Ekthor register the name. The schoolteacher had said she would speak if it came to that, and she had meant it. She has documentation going back 14 years, including 3 years of inflated tithe records. The woman, who looked like a magistrate, turned slightly toward Ekthor. One of the hired men looked at another hired man. Barrett arrived then, coming up the road in his dray cart with 2 of his grown sons and a face like January. He didn't say anything. He just stopped the cart at the edge of Victor's property line and sat there. Other people appeared, not many, 4, 5, neighbors who had been quiet, who had made their discomfort known through silence and distance, but they came to the edge of the yard, and they stood there, and the crowd of 7 became a crowd of 12. Ekthor was a man who understood weight. He understood when a room had shifted. He looked at Victor, at Orlena in the doorway, at the baby, at Barrett, at the watching faces. "You're making enemies," he said. "I already had one," Victor said. "The rest of these people are just reminding you of something." Ekthor left. The magistrate woman left quickly. The hired men followed, the way hired men do when payment has become uncertain. Barrett climbed down from the cart and shook Victor's hand without a word. Avret came up the path and put a small parcel of bread on the porch step and said, "Good," and went home. Victor stood in his yard until the road was empty and the afternoon had gone grey. Then he went back inside and hung his plane on its hook and washed his hands. Spring reached Millbrook late that year, the way it always did in the north. Not arriving so much as seeping in, melting one edge at a time, turning the frozen mud to soft mud and then to actual earth that smelled like something alive. Elias was 3 months old and had opinions about everything. He objected to being set down. He approved of firelight. He was uncertain about the grey cat that had wandered in from Barrett's mill weeks earlier and decided to stay, and he expressed this uncertainty loudly. He had begun to recognize Orlena's voice and would turn toward it in the particular way of a person locating something that matters. Victor was building a second chair, not a commission, for the kitchen table because there were 2 people who used it now, and one of the chairs had always rocked slightly on the left leg, and it bothered him. He shaped the new piece from a length of ash he'd been saving, and he carved a small leaf pattern along the back, because he had discovered that once you start carving leaves into things, you can't particularly stop. Ekthor had not returned. The land advocate had sent back a brief letter confirming the registration, with a note that a preliminary inquiry had been opened into the tithe discrepancies. This was not justice exactly, but it was process. And process was what kept men like Ekthor honest, or at least careful. Orlena had begun teaching Elias words, not in the clan tongue, though she sometimes spoke that too, low and rhythmic, the consonants like struck stone. She taught him the plain common words, fire, hand, warm. She held up the objects and said the words, and Elias regarded each one with the gravity of someone doing serious work. Victor watched this from the workshop doorway one afternoon, watched Orlena hold up a piece of pine dowel and say wood, and watched Elias take it in both hands and immediately try to eat it. And he thought about Lucy. He thought about her often, but differently now than he had in the dark months after she died, less like pressing on a wound, more like remembering a direction. He had told her, in that place behind the ribs where promises live, that he would keep Elias alive. He was keeping that promise. He had not specified how, and he suspected she had known that. She had always understood that problems get solved by what's available, not by what's proper. The shimmer near the cradle was still there sometimes. Not often, once in a while, at the edge of sleep or at the low hour before dawn. He had stopped being unsettled by it. He thought it was probably satisfied. Outside, the pines above the ridge had gone from winter dark to the particular bright green of new needles, and the road to Millbrook was dry enough to raise dust when a cart went by, and the creek ran high and cold and clean. Barrett stopped in one afternoon, with a wheel that needed a spoke replaced, and he stayed for bread and chicory and looked at Elias for a while and said, "Strong boy." Then he looked at Orlena and nodded once. She dipped her chin and he seemed satisfied. The town had not entirely softened. There were still people who crossed the street and people who said things in the way of people who say things to feel larger. But the settlement holds to what it can see, and what it could see now was a child who had been dying and was not dying, and a man who had kept his footing, and a woman who had not asked for anything she hadn't earned. Victor finished the chair that evening and set it at the table and pressed down on each leg to check the level, and it was solid. He sat in it. Orlena was at the hearth with Elias on her knee, saying, "Fire," and the boy was watching the flames with absolute absorption. The house was warm. The smoke rose straight in the still air. Somewhere under the floorboards, the cat had found a corner and was content. Victor looked at the ash chair and at the oak chair and at the cradle with the leaves along the headboard, and he thought that a man could do worse than to be a carpenter in a world that kept breaking things. Because there would always be work, and there would always be things worth fixing, and sometimes, if you kept your hands open, the work would find you first. He said good night to no one in particular. The fire burned low. Elias slept. The shimmer was there for just a moment, near the cradle's corner, and then it was not.